The global seed industry is worth $65 billion a year. That number only works if people keep buying seeds every season, year after year. The modern seed market has been deliberately engineered to make sure they do, through hybrid varieties that produce one vigorous generation and then either fail to reproduce or produce something completely unpredictable. Plant them once and you get a crop. Save those seeds, plant them next year, and you will get something that barely resembles the original. The industry calls this hybrid vigor, but what it actually is a subscription model. Here is what I find genuinely unsettling about that. For the previous 10,000 years of human agriculture, nobody bought seeds. You planted, you harvested, you saved the best seeds and planted them again next spring. The plant came back. In many cases, it came back without you planting anything, because perennial crops do not need replanting at all. You put them in the ground once, and they return every year on their own, sometimes for decades, sometimes for a century. There are plants growing right now in abandoned Roman gardens in Britain, still producing food with nobody tending them. There are Andean crops that fed empires for 2,000 years, that Spanish colonizers spent a century trying to eradicate, and that still exist today in the hands of a few dozen growers worldwide. There are medieval staples that appeared in every European kitchen garden from the year 900 to the year 1700, and then vanished so completely that most gardeners today have never heard their names. This video is about those plants, and about why, out of the thousands of perennial food crops that human civilizations developed over 10 millennia, the modern food industry has somehow landed on a catalog that requires you to buy something new every single spring. Before the first crop, some context. Of the 7,000 plant species humans have cultivated as food throughout history, 75% of the genetic diversity has been lost since 1900. That is not an estimate. That is a figure from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. 3/4 of the agricultural biodiversity our ancestors spent 10,000 years developing is gone in 1 century. What replaced it was a narrow selection of annual crops optimized for a single thing: industrial production. Uniform size, uniform ripening time, tolerance for mechanical harvesting, shelf life long enough to survive a distribution chain. These are real engineering achievements, but they came at a cost that mostly went unmentioned: the systematic abandonment of everything that did not fit the machine. The mechanism is worth understanding because it was not a decision made in a single room by a committee. It happened through thousands of small economic pressures applied consistently over decades. University extension programs recommended crops that were commercially viable. Seed companies invested in breeding programs for varieties that sold at volume. Garden centers stocked what their customers asked for. Customers asked for what they had seen advertised, and the plants that did not fit any part of that loop. The ones that did not need to be purchased every year. The ones that could not be harvested at industrial scale. The ones whose qualities were suited to a kitchen garden rather than a supermarket shelf quietly disappeared from the catalog, then from the garden, then from living memory. The plants I am about to show you did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they could not be industrialized. That is a completely different thing, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we start. The first crop is OK. Oxalis tuberosa. A small, colorful tuber from the Andes, cultivated for at least 8,000 years across what is now Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. It comes in dozens of varieties: red, orange, yellow, pink, cream, purple, and has a slightly lemony taste when freshly harvested that mellows out after a few days in the sun. Oca arrived in Europe at roughly the same time as the potato in the 16th century. Agricultural trials were conducted in France and England in the 1820s. The results were encouraging. The plant resisted many of the diseases that were already beginning to devastate European potato crops. It produced well. People who tasted it liked it. And then it was abandoned. Not because it failed, because it tuberized too late. In the Andes, oca produces its tubers under the short days of autumn. At Andean latitudes, that happens before the killing frosts. In northern Europe, the short days arrive so late in the year that the tubers do not have time to develop before frost ends the season. It was not a flavor problem or a yield problem, it was a calendar problem. And since no one was particularly interested in breeding varieties adapted to different latitudes, there was no commercial incentive to do so, and the crop was simply set aside. Today, oca is the second most widely consumed tuber in New Zealand, where it was introduced in the 20th century and marketed under the name yam. In its native Andes, it never went anywhere. In the rest of the world, it barely exists in cultivation. Plant it once. Leave a few small tubers in the ground at harvest. It returns the following year without any intervention. The second crop is Mashua, Tropaeolum tuberosum. It is an Andean climbing plant related to nasturtium. It produces edible tubers, edible leaves, and edible flowers. Its documented yields reach 70 to 100 tons per hectare under good conditions, comparable to the most productive conventional crops in the world. It grows at altitudes of 3,000 to 4,000 meters, where almost nothing else will. It contains glucosinolates that naturally repel insects, so it requires no pesticide input. The Spanish colonial chronicles of the 16th and 17th centuries document deliberate attempts to suppress Mashua cultivation among indigenous Andean populations. The official justifications varied. The real situation was simpler: a crop that grows without purchased inputs, resists pests without chemicals, produces at extreme altitudes on marginal land, and multiplies itself year after year is a form of food sovereignty. Colonial agricultural systems depended on dependency. Mashua did not fit. It still grows in the Andes. Outside the Andes, almost nobody has heard of it. The third crop is Ulluco, Ullucus tuberosus. Cultivated for 10,000 years, it is second only to the potato in the Andean food system. The tubers are small and startlingly colorful: yellow, orange, pink, red, green, purple, and sometimes spotted or streaked with multiple colors. The betalains responsible for that color are the same antioxidant compounds found in beets, and some betalain variants in Ulluco have not been found in any other edible plant. The leaves are edible like spinach, and the tubers contain roughly twice the vitamin C of a potato. Ulluco sailed on the same ships as the potato when the Spanish brought Andean crops to Europe in the 16th century. The problem was the same as oca: it tuberizes under short autumn days, too late for northern European frosts. The potato tuberizes earlier and produces larger individual tubers more suited to mechanical harvesting, so it outcompeted Ulluco by default. Ulluco stayed in South America, where it remains a market staple across Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador. A seed company in New Zealand spent 20 years developing frost-tolerant varieties and rebranded it as Earth Gems. Outside New Zealand, it remains essentially unknown in Western horticulture. The fourth crop is Skirret, Sium cisarum. A perennial root vegetable in the carrot family, it produces clusters of sweet white roots from a single crown that returns every year. The Roman Emperor Tiberius had Skirret imported from Germany because he considered it exceptional. It appeared in every significant medieval and Renaissance European kitchen garden. Recipes for Skirret appear in English cookbooks continuously from the medieval period through to approximately 1700. And then, in the space of about 2 generations, it disappeared almost completely from European gardens. The potato did most of the damage. But the specific reason Skirret could not compete was not flavor. Everyone who grows it describes the taste as superior to carrot. It was the roots. Skirret produces multiple small roots per crown, each with a fibrous central core that needs to be removed before eating. You cannot peel it with a commercial peeler. You cannot process it at speed in a factory. One potato gives you one large, uniform, peelable object. One Skirret crown gives you a tangle of irregular small roots that require patient hand preparation. The plant never failed. The food system moved on and left it behind. Divide the crown every few years and replant the divisions. It spreads slowly and reliably, producing food indefinitely from the original planting. The fifth crop is Scorzonera. Scorzonera hispanica is a long black root with white flesh. It is a perennial cultivated across southern and central Europe for centuries. Belgium, France, and the Netherlands were still growing it commercially at significant scale into the mid-20th century. The flavor has been compared to asparagus, to oysters, and to something between a parsnip and an artichoke, depending on how it is prepared. It was a standard item in Victorian kitchen gardens in Britain, served in white sauce or hollandaise the way asparagus is served today. The reason it vanished from supermarkets is purely mechanical. The root is fragile. It snaps easily if you pull it at the wrong angle. Once snapped, it loses its freshness rapidly. High-speed mechanical harvesting destroys a significant percentage of the crop. The distribution chain that can handle asparagus, which is also fragile but in a way that can be managed, cannot handle Scorzonera at commercial volumes. But in a garden where you dig one root at a time and cook it the same day, none of that matters. The flavor is there. The plant is there. It left the supermarket, not the soil. Leave some roots in the ground each autumn and it returns the following year. Leave it undisturbed for 2 years and the roots reach their best size and flavor. Chenopodium bonus henricus. A perennial leafy plant, Good King Henry is distinct from a toxic relative called stinking goosefoot, known as bad Henry, which it slightly resembles. It produces 3 distinct harvests from a single planting. Spring leaves used like spinach, young stems used like asparagus, and seeds used like quinoa. 1 plant, 1 planting. 3 harvests across the season. It was cultivated in every European kitchen garden from roughly the 9th century through the 18th century. Then annual spinach varieties, developed specifically for commercial production, quick to germinate, productive in a single cutting, and harvestable by machine, made it economically irrelevant. Spinach can be sown, grown, and cut in one pass and sold. Good King Henry produces progressively over months, which is ideal for a household, but useless for a harvest machine. The Journal of Food Composition and Analysis has published analysis showing its protein content is comparable to quinoa. This plant fed medieval Europe for 800 years. Today, almost no one outside the permaculture community grows it. Once established, which takes 1 season, it returns every year without replanting. The 7th crop is Babington's leek. Allium ampeloprasum, Babington variety. A perennial leek that has been growing in Britain since Roman times, possibly earlier. Specimens still grow semi-wild on coastal cliffs in Cornwall, on the same cliff faces where they have been cultivated for centuries and were eventually just left when the practice of tending them ended. The annual leek was standardized for commercial production in the 20th century. Plant in spring, harvest in autumn, clear the bed, start again. 1 season, 1 transaction. Babington's leek does not work that way. It produces through most of the year, spreads via small bulbils that form on the flower heads and drop to the ground, creating new plants, and slowly colonizes an area on its own over several seasons. The flavor is milder than a standard leek with a slight garlic note. You do not manage it so much as let it establish. Once it does, it provides harvests with almost no intervention for as long as you leave it alone. The 8th crop is sea kale, Crambe maritima, a coastal perennial native to the shores of Europe, harvested wild from British beaches since antiquity and domesticated into kitchen gardens in the late 18th century. Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello after learning the cultivation techniques during his time in Europe. Victorian gardeners forced the young shoots by covering the crowns with terracotta pots in late winter, producing white, tender spears that looked and tasted like a cross between asparagus and cauliflower. The asparagus industry ended it. Not because sea kale was inferior, many people who have eaten both consider sea kale the superior vegetable, but because asparagus, once established in a commercial growing system, produces higher yields per acre at lower labor cost. Sea kale requires 3 years from planting before it yields its first harvest. That 3-year window is commercially indefensible in any industry operating on annual financial cycles. In a garden, 3 years is nothing. You plant it once in year 1. In year 4 and every year after, you harvest from it. The same crowns producing for 20 years or more. The 9th crop is Apios Americana, the groundnut vine. A climbing vine native to eastern North America, it produces chains of edible tubers along underground rhizomes, like a string of irregular beads buried in the soil. It is a legume, which means it fixes atmospheric nitrogen at its roots. It needs no fertilizer input because it makes its own. The flowers are pink-purple and fragrant. The tubers are starchy and nutritious, with roughly 3 times the protein content of a potato. It fed indigenous communities across eastern North America for thousands of years, including Narragansett, Wampanoag, Cherokee, and others. Historical records indicate that the Plymouth colonists survived their first winter partly by trading for and foraging Apios tubers. They knew what it was. They ate it because it kept them alive. In the 1980s and the 1990s, researchers at Louisiana State University developed improved varieties with significantly larger tubers. The research was published. The results were good. And then nothing happened. No commercial variety reached market. The reason is not complicated. Apios takes 2 to 3 years to produce significant yields. It is difficult to harvest mechanically because the tubers form along irregular rhizomes rather than in predictable clusters, and as a native species, it cannot be patented. There is no intellectual property angle. There is no recurring seed sale. There is no business model. It is still there, growing wild across the eastern United States, fixing nitrogen, producing food that almost no one harvests anymore. The 10th crop is Caucasian spinach. Hablitzia tamnoides, a climbing perennial vine from the Caucasus Mountains related to beets and spinach. It grows to 3 meters tall, covering whatever structure you give it, a trellis, a fence, an old fruit tree. The young leaves and shoots harvested in spring and early summer taste like mild spinach with a slightly succulent texture. It tolerates temperatures down to approximately -30 degrees Celsius, which means it survives winters that would kill almost anything else in a garden. A single established plant produces harvests for 20 to 30 years. It was introduced to botanical gardens in Scandinavia in the 19th century by plant explorers. It grows well in northern climates. It requires almost no care once established, and it has essentially zero commercial presence because its leaves are tender and delicate, wilting and losing quality within hours of harvest. That shelf life problem puts it outside the entire commercial fresh vegetable distribution system. For a gardener who picks leaves and cooks them the same morning, it is not a problem at all. If you search for Hablitzia tamnoides on YouTube right now, you will find fewer than 10 videos in English that cover it with any depth. A plant that produces food for 30 years from a single planting, survives Arctic temperatures, and requires almost no attention. 10 videos. I keep coming back to that number. Here's what connects all 10 of these plants. None of them failed. The OCA was not less nutritious than the potato. The Mashua was not less productive than anything the commercial system replaced it with. The Skirret did not stop tasting good. The sea kale did not disappear because people stopped liking it. Every one of these plants was displaced not by a better plant, but by a more industrializable plant. A plant whose characteristics happened to align with mechanical harvesting, long-distance distribution, annual purchasing cycles, and intellectual property frameworks. The $65 billion seed industry does not exist because annual hybrid crops are the best crops humans have developed. It exists because they are the most profitable crops to sell. Those are different things. And here is what I find worth acknowledging. The people running that industry are not villains. They are responding to incentives. When the financial system rewards annual sales over long-term food sovereignty, you get annual crops. When research funding flows toward patentable varieties, you get patentable varieties. When supermarket distribution chains demand uniform, shelf-stable produce, you get produce engineered for uniformity and shelf life. Nobody sat down and decided to erase 8,000 years of OCA cultivation. It just became, quietly and incrementally, commercially inconvenient to preserve it, which means the responsibility for preserving it falls somewhere else, specifically in gardens. Some of these plants are hard to find. Some take 2 or 3 years to establish before they produce well. Some will not suit every climate, and I am not pretending otherwise. Hablitzia might not survive a wet southern summer. Apios might not produce much in a short growing season. Mashua needs to be matched to the right microclimate, but every single one of them is still alive, still producing somewhere. The knowledge of how to grow them never fully disappeared. It just stopped being economically convenient to share. A garden built around even 3 or 4 of these crops looks fundamentally different from the seed catalog dependency that modern gardening has become. Not because it is easier, necessarily, because the relationship changes. You plant once, you tend, you harvest for years, sometimes decades. You are not a customer anymore. You are a custodian. These plants were here before the seed industry existed. Most of them will be here long after it is gone. The only question is whether you are growing them.